Welcome to Cambridge Forum. Tonight's topic, key issues for election 2014. Just adjust this a little here. I'm Michelle Johnson from Boston University, where I teach multimedia journalism, and I will be your moderator this evening. The midterm congressional elections may still seem far off in the future, but with Congress experiencing record low approval ratings, are voters primed to look seriously at policy positions of the candidates? What are some of the key issues voters should be attuned to as they sort through the positions of those running to be their representatives? Millennial voters are often pointed to as the new swing constituency in the election. Well, what issues are they concerned about? Our panel will explore some of the fundamental questions newly elected representatives will have to address and proposes research and experience-based policy solutions in an effort to overcome the ideological divisions that derail so much of the political debate. I'd like to introduce our panelists and the topics, and then we'll hear from each one of them. Keith, and I'm hoping I get your last name correct. Keith Bentele is assistant professor of sociology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. His research focuses on the intersection of public policy and social stratification and inequality. His most recent publication, Distinct Paths to Higher Equality, a qualitative comparative analysis of rising earnings inequality among U.S. states, 1980 to 2010, provides a state-by-state comparison of wage inequality in the United States over the past 30 years. He has also recently examined moves to restrict access to the ballot and the performance of the social safety net during the Great Recession. Next, Alex Hertel-Fernandez is a PhD student in government and policy and a fellow in the multidisciplinary program in inequality and social policy at Harvard University. His research interests include social insurance, taxes, inequality, and the politics of business and labor organization in advanced democracies. His recent papers have focused on the role of business organizations have played in shaping the current U.S. tax policy. Next, Jack Schneider is assistant professor of education at College of the Holy Cross, where his courses examine the history of education, urban education, and education reform. His blog, K-12 Schools Beyond the Rhetoric, sets up a dialogue between him and Michelle Rhee, who's the former chancellor of the District of Columbia Public Schools, about the many controversial aspects of the current trends in education reform, such as high-stakes testing and methods of teacher evaluation. His first book, Excellence for All, examined the current education reform movement. His latest book, From the Ivory Tower to the Schoolhouse, How Scholarship Becomes Common Knowledge in Education, attempts to identify the factors that are necessary for successful education, innovation, and reform. So first, let's hear from Keith from the University of Massachusetts as he looks at issues of poverty and inequality. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Keith.
So as was mentioned, much of my research is on economic inequality and the safety net in the United States. And as I was preparing for this, the one issue that really kept coming up for me again and again that kind of stands head and shoulders above the rest is that we still have an unemployment crisis in the United States. And I feel like there's not, in my opinion, as much attention to this issue. And I don't think this is something that will be anywhere near resolved by the time we approach the election this November. So by the most commonly used metric, the unemployment rate in April was 6.3%. And a lot of people have taken this as kind of a comforting news that unemployment is getting to a reasonable level. But this level of 6.3% is actually was the peak unemployment rate that we reached during the recession that started after 2001. And at the time, that was not seen as a comforting or reasonable level of unemployment. And furthermore, many people have stressed that we've had a real decline in labor force participation that's very extreme and unique to this recession, meaning a lot of people have pulled out of the labor market and are no longer counted as part of the unemployed. And so it's not misleading, but it gives a slightly distorted picture of labor market conditions to focus on that metric. And if you use a different measure of unemployment and underemployment, which looks at people who are discouraged workers who have pulled out of the labor market, who would still like to work but they're not actively trying, and workers who are working part-time but they would really prefer to be working full-time, that's something like 12.3%. So that represents a very large portion of the labor market that is either unemployed or underemployed. Also, at the state level, the recession has been really uneven in terms of how harsh the effects have been. And as recently as March, 7 states still have unemployment rates above 7%, and 4 states still have unemployment rates above 8%. So California, Nevada, Rhode Island, and Illinois are in that condition. So this is over 6 years past the beginning of the recession. So this is a very, very slow and long recovery. And these really kind of grinding levels of unemployment year after year not only have an enormous human cost, but they also exacerbate the levels of poverty and inequality within these states. And so those are the 2 issues I've been asked to focus on today. So in general, I would say that people who are talking about or seriously debating issues that really take into account short-term and longer-term solutions for these issues of unemployment and underemployment, I think those are really critical issues that are going to be around for quite a long time, as they are major problems afflicting our labor market. Turning to poverty specifically, so the most recent and I think best measure of poverty used by the Census Bureau puts the poverty rate at 16%, which is roughly 50 million Americans who are currently in poverty. And as a consequence, about 22% of American children are now living in poor households. And while poverty has increased because of the recession, poverty rates have been very kind of stubborn over time over the last 30 years, so kind of drifting between 11 to 15% since the early 1970s. And so unfortunately, over the last 40 years, we've made very little progress in substantively reducing these rates of poverty after the very successful reductions of poverty that did occur during the 1960s. So what is this about? And this is a very complex question, but I think there are 2 major things to focus on. And as coming from a sociological and kind of a structural perspective on these issues, I think this is a efficient way to think about it. And I think that using this lens leads you to particular types of policy solutions for poverty. And so I think that in terms of evaluating candidates or evaluating politicians, people who are speaking a language that is resonant with the framework I'm about to present about poverty, I think those are the people who are kind of more tapped into a deeper conversation about what can actually be done. So I think the easiest way to think about poverty is that there's 2 major problems happening. First and foremost, there's a labor market failure that's occurring, and to a lesser extent, there's a policy failure that's going on. In terms of the labor market failure, while some people may consider the next comment controversial or ideological, it is really just this uncomfortable truth that in recent decades, the economy has not provided enough jobs for everybody who wants to work, and has not provided enough jobs at wages that are sufficiently high to pull people out of poverty. That may be very uncontroversial to some people, but this is still a matter of some debate for many. And so there are 2 pieces here. Okay, so the first is that levels of economic growth, the type of economic growth, the levels of economic growth that we need to get to a point of employment that really starts to bring in low-income families has generally not been happening in recent decades, right? We've reached at the heights of the booms, we've sort of just started bringing in very low-income families, but this has only been kind of momentary over the last couple decades. The second piece is that this here is the failure of trickle down, right? This is where the economy is not sufficiently spreading down to everyone. And in general, overall economic growth in the United States in recent decades has become disconnected from the incomes of low-income families. So overall GDP growth, for example, is not strongly connected to changes in the incomes and earnings of low-income households. The second piece is about this lack of jobs, with earnings high enough to bring your family out of poverty. And so this is the issue of rising inequality. So over the last 50 years, GDP per capita in the United States has doubled, right? So we've had enormous increases in the amount of productive activity and profit being generated by our economy. But rising inequality has skewed the distribution of that growth to the upper tails of the distribution. And so it is this rising inequality which is the major factor that has delinked overall economic growth and income growth amongst low-income families. And so when economic gains are widely shared, right, that's when the cliche about the rising tide lifting all boats, that's when that can occur. And it was the case in the post-war period that economic gains were very widely shared, and the incomes of low-wage households did increase as the economy did better, and poverty did go down as overall growth expanded. But since the 1970s, this has no longer been true, and rising inequality is a major cause of that. So high poverty is a product, of labor market failures. But this is not a phenomenon that is unique to the US economy or unique to the US. So amongst affluent democracies in general, it is usually the case that the market does not provide enough economic opportunities to bring people out of poverty. So one example that I like to use a lot is that in 2000, if you compare France and the United States, market-based child poverty was 27% roughly in both of these countries, meaning if there were no welfare benefits, if there were no tax credits, 27% of children in both of these countries were in poverty. After you add in social welfare benefits, in the United States, that rate drops from 27 to 22%, while in France it drops from 27 to just over 7%. And so the generosity of the welfare system and the accessibility of those benefits is really critical to mitigating how much market-generated poverty translates into actual poverty and practice. And Scandinavian countries, just as an aside, do remarkably better. So child poverty in those countries is sometimes under 4%, under 5%, okay, with similar levels of market-based poverty before the welfare state intervenes. So that brings us to the policy failure piece of it. So very simply, we just do not do enough to mitigate the levels of poverty that are produced by the labor market. But I want to be clear that this is not an issue of anti-poverty policies failing themselves. The programs that we have in place really do significantly mitigate income losses and reduce poverty for low-income families. One study estimated in 2012 that the US poverty rate would have been 15 full percentage points higher in the absence of all tax credits and benefits. And so there's really major mitigation going on. And these benefits and credits, they really do reduce economic strain and stress for these families. That is very true. The point is just that we're not doing enough, essentially. Okay, so from this perspective, overall rates of poverty are produced by the structure of the economy and the structure of the welfare benefits within a state or within a nation. And so from this perspective, discussions of poverty that emphasize cultural factors or individual choices or dispositions are unhelpful for at least two reasons. The first piece is that they just miss the larger structural factors that are driving the majority of the phenomenon. And the second piece is they focus our attention on elements of the problem that may be real, but they're often elements that are very difficult to address through public policy. So I'm thinking here specifically of efforts to change culture around work ethic or trying to encourage people to engage in different types of household formation. Even if these efforts were to succeed, which I think is unlikely to shape these behaviors through public policy, they're really only addressing a very small piece of the problem. They kind of miss the meat of the major structural factors that are driving these phenomena. So to oversimplify for a second, the main issue is simply that people do not have enough money due either to low wages or to a lack of an ability to find employment. And so I think that stepping back, it's not that I think poverty is often presented as this nebulous, intractable social problem that will always be with us. But I think the cross-national evidence is very clear that we have a lot of the tools, we have a lot of the models that we can draw upon to very dramatically reduce poverty. And from that perspective, it's mostly about political choices, right? What are we going to do as a society to address these issues, and to what depth are we going to let families fall, right? Those are really social and political choices that we're making, even if we're pretending that it's some phenomenon that we have no control over. So in that context, we have a wide range of possible solutions. And just to mention a few, we can make employers provide more support through higher wages. As taxpayers, we can make up the difference between what people actually make and what we consider to be a reasonable standard of living through social welfare benefits. And the government can play a more active role in making sure that there are sufficient employment opportunities in the economy. I personally think that we should be doing all three to different degrees, and that's a kind of a multi-pronged approach to poverty reduction. And I should mention, and people will also find this potentially controversial, but I think the cross-national evidence is very clear that this is very doable, it's actually very affordable, and it's compatible with reasonable economic growth. So to get to that point, though, right, this requires extremely deep change in both the way that we conceptualize the role of the safety net in the United States, and especially in the rhetoric that we use to discuss welfare. And at a national level, realistically, there's major short-term political obstacles to anything like what I've just mentioned. Specifically, you would require very large congressional majorities of a party that was not deeply ideologically opposed to the expansion of the welfare state. So that's obviously kind of a precondition that would be necessary to make progress on some of these issues. And I think this is something I'm sure that we will discuss in more detail today. I just want to add also that recently, a number of prominent economists, including Larry Summers and Paul Krugman, they've been floating the idea that we may have already entered an era of very prolonged and reduced economic growth, and that it may be the case that we can expect the economy to be growing at a very slow pace, potentially for many years to come. And so if this is the case, and I want to stress that we don't know this is true, but if this is the case, this creates a couple situations. One, it undermines our ability to try to reduce poverty through economic growth. And it also, I think, makes a very strong case for the need to think much differently about the role of the government in the economy, and specifically about an expanded role for fiscal policy, and also having to think more seriously about active labor market policies, and even industrial policy being taken more seriously as a major policy component. And so basically, in other words, we really need to consider a significantly larger role for the state in subsidizing, if not actually providing jobs to reduce unemployment and poverty. I also said I would talk about inequality, which is this incredibly sprawling, amazingly complex topic that I'm happy to talk about in great detail during the Q&A if you want to. But I just want to say very briefly a couple things. I think rising inequality is a central challenge facing our society. Inequality produces a wide range of problems. At the bottom, this is a major contributing factor to poverty. At the top, you have the issue of concentrated political power. And despite a very brief slowdown of inequality briefly in the beginning of the recession, rising inequality has continued over the last couple of years during the recovery. So if there's a positive note to sign about that, positive note to ring about that, we are living in a moment where there's kind of an unusually high level of attention and concern about rising inequality. And this is good in that that's an obvious necessary precondition to any type of social movement activism or political activism mobilized around reducing inequality. In the short term, however, I think we have this really pressing need in terms of this unemployment crisis. I think we need more stimulus to further reduce unemployment. This could include increased federal aid to state and local governments. I would strongly support continued and increased unemployment insurance and other types of safety net benefits. And potentially, again, in my opinion, I think massive investment in infrastructure repair would be a very reasonable and logical response to our current situation. And so there's this distance, though, between those things and the kind of political reality that we're living in right now and what is considered politically possible. But I think the really important piece that can happen now is kind of trying to shift what is considered politically possible, right? And this can happen through different avenues. One is simply, again, raising awareness of these issues, activism, trying to highlight attention to kind of shift the range of what's considered possible in this moment. And then obviously the other avenue is to change who is making the political decisions at the moment, right? And so that can radically change what is politically possible. And so while I'm not optimistic, I shouldn't make predictions if this is going to be coming out later, but I'm not super optimistic about the Democrats' chances in the election this fall in terms of control of Congress. I think that there is still a lot of work to be done in terms of building the broader political momentum for these longer-term changes that I'm talking about. And so this is a very long political project to really reshape society in very deep ways. And so that's not something that's going to happen over the course of 1 or 2 congressional elections. It really requires shifting the policy agenda of political parties and replacing politicians with people who do have kind of what I would argue to be a more accurate perspective on the realities of this situation that we're currently in. So I have different ideas about how that can be accomplished, but I think I'm out of time, so I'll save that for the discussion.
Okay, thanks for that great overview. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then I believe we can open it up for a few from our audience here. I do want to follow up on that issue of your gazing into a crystal ball on the Democrats' chances next year, and kind of tie this back directly to election 2014. You touched on a number of issues: unemployment, poverty. Which of those things do you think will resonate most? And let's talk specifically about the millennials. Among all of those issues, are any of those resonating with them?
Well, I mean, I think unemployment is unavoidably a concern. I mean, the last few years has been a very unique experience of people graduating and having just a very shocking lack of opportunities. And so I think we have this generation of people that are really profoundly shaped by this experience of graduating or entering the labor market in different ways during this time period. So I don't know that translates into support for infrastructure.
That was my next question.
Yeah, I know.
Why is that not sending them to the polls in droves?
Well, I think it requires political leadership to lay out those connections, and I think you need clear, articulate explanations that would motivate voters along those levels. And I'm not. So there are definitely some Democratic politicians who do a good job of this, but I think as a general line from the party that this has not been well articulated. But I think it could be, and I think that they will be scrambling to find any line that works. And so I think potentially that's a connection that could be made.
And you think they've done a better job on the GOP side? Because my understanding is that younger voters who vote Republican tend to have a higher turnout than on the Democratic side.
Yeah, I think that the Republicans are making appeals on other dimensions, often emotional appeals, cultural appeals, and so they're not speaking directly necessarily to these experiences of unemployment, for example, except perhaps to bash the Obama administration for being responsible for this bad condition or something like that. So right. I think there's an oppositional appeal that we would do something different, but there's no details and there's definitely no specific policy proposals, in my opinion, that would significantly mitigate the poverty or the ongoing unemployment problem.
Sure. Why don't we turn to our audience and see if you guys have a few questions that you'd like to have Keith address on.
My name's Robert Chu, and I'm a Democrat, and I'm wondering how the GOP can have any realistic grounds other than to buy an election to get really realistic votes to, because the Obamacare seems like a dead issue now because that's becoming very successful, and I think there's a number of other issues that the environment and so forth that would impede voting for Republicans. What can give them a basis for winning the Senate in 2014 coming up? I live in Cambridge, but that's the thing. I'm not realistic, I suppose, with regard to the country. But please tell me.
Yeah, yeah. It can seem shocking, I guess. Yeah, I think the main thing to think about is that unfortunately, most voters have a very superficial interaction with kind of current political events for the most part. And people vote the majority of people vote based on their perception of how the economy is doing and their political affiliation that they've garnered from their friendships and their social networks for the most part. And so people who are regular voters kind of will reliably turn out to vote. They're not deciding whether or not to based on necessarily some specifics. You have the very, very mobilized partisans that are really dug in on either side, and I think it's really easy to find any of the intellectual scaffolding you need to justify that vote is completely available to you in our media culture. And so I think that if you have a disposition, it's very easy to rationalize it regardless of what's actually happening in terms of actual policy debates or actual outcomes. And then on top of that, you had the midterms where the composition of the electorate tends to to benefit Republicans. It's older, it's whiter, and that tends to help them out consistently. Lower turnout during midterms benefits Republicans. And so I think it's kind of just a mechanical product of those forces that impact our elections. And it almost shouldn't be interpreted in terms of what's actually going on as describing voter behavior, unfortunately, in sort of my dark perspective on that.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Klein, and I'd like to ask you or the other two speakers when it's their turn. I'm a pragmatist, and I need help in understanding why it's not in the self-interest of a millennial, of even a Tea Party person, to understand that it costs more for the kinds of policies to be implemented you're suggesting, rather than to have people not have health care and go to the emergency room and pay more, not have a job and therefore require governmental services. I've never understood why the pragmatic argument doesn't work.
Somebody else want to?
Well, no, they're going next, but this is all your time. Unless we could hold this until we get to the full panel discussion.
What,
Do you want to do that?
Okay.
All right, why don't we do that? Why don't we move on to our next, I'm sorry, we have one more.
Follow up, actually. My name
Sure.
is Ali Sulo, and I'd like to follow up to the question that you were asking
Sure.
about the infrastructure as being the solution to job creation. I spent 34 and a half years in the publishing industry and worked for a major Boston publisher that was acquired by Bain Capital and Thomas Blackstone and Lee, and watched how the outsourcing took place. And one of the last major programs that I was involved in was the Spanish reading programs for grades K through 6. And the translation was done in South America. The production was done in India, and the printing was done in China. These are books that are in U.S. public schools in grades K through 6. All of the staff that had done those jobs had been at 222 Berkeley Street in Boston. So, what are the other things besides infrastructure work that can happen in terms of policy to deal with other types of job creation, the outsourcing issue, et cetera, et cetera? I'd love to hear some thoughts on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, the issue of outsourcing, so outsourcing is a major contributing factor to rising inequality and also to rising job instability over the course of people's working careers. So I would say that most people say, we're not going to try to interrupt outsourcing or interrupt these dimensions of global trade or transaction, but you can think about how do we mitigate the impacts of those things. And so having robust unemployment insurance that kicks in, having special types of compensation and retraining for people who are impacted in trades that are particularly affected by international trade or outsourcing are solutions that exist but are not sufficiently funded and not sufficiently robust to deal with the problem. There's also some more expansive ideas about wage insurance, which is basically this idea that upon losing a job, you'll have some level of compensation relative to your previous wage as you kind of retrain or look for a new career. This is implemented very successfully in a number of Scandinavian countries and in a couple of countries in Europe. That is, I think, a little far to expect in the U.S. system, but basically, if you take some of the consequences, like losing your health insurance, out of the equation, or if you have a reliable unemployment system that's there to catch you, it can make those transitions less catastrophic for people. And so I would say, again, that focusing on ways to mitigate those transitions is probably the best way to respond. Because this isn't going to stop, and this is going to accelerate quite dramatically.
For most of the younger people who are just starting their careers,
Yes.
what was happening
Hang on.
is that they had to reinvent themselves. They couldn't find that same career somewhere else in the Boston area.
Okay. Well, this is a great segue to our next speaker, Alex Hertel-Fernandez. He'll be speaking on tax policy and the social safety net.
Yes, were you a plant or something setting me up for the social benefit side of things? So, yeah. Well, thanks, and thanks to you all for coming out to discuss these important issues. I've been asked to talk about the social safety net and tax policy. And at first glance, it might seem as if these two topics are unrelated to each other. But I actually think there are good reasons to discuss them together. First is the simple fact that much of our social welfare system is actually run through the tax code. And as Keith alluded to, many of our successful social policies are actually tax credits for working poor families. The most notable example of this is the earned income tax credit. And aside from the fact that we administer so much through the tax code, I also think it's important for our elected officials when they're debating expanding new social programs or expanding existing ones. I think it's important for them to talk about how they're going to pay for those policies, and that's where taxes come in. Indeed, I think for far too long, advocates of a more expansive safety net, Democrats especially over the past few decades, have ignored talking about the connection between taxes and social benefits, really at their own peril. And this is a subject that I want to return to towards the end of my remarks. But to begin, I want to start by highlighting some of the biggest holes that I see in our social safety net, and that I think our elected officials, both aspiring and actual elected officials, need to discuss and debate in the upcoming elections. First, we need to acknowledge that America has a retirement security crisis. This isn't the crisis that many of you may heard afflicting Social Security's finances, and we can have a discussion over in the next segment about how the Social Security crisis isn't really the crisis that it's made out to be. But it's a crisis of America's own household finances. Social Security, our own main retirement system in this country, was really constructed for a world where people could count on other sources of retirement income, perhaps most notably defined benefit pensions. And these are pensions that offer a guaranteed stream of income to retired individuals and their families in old age. And now, as many of you well know, defined benefit pensions are a thing of the past, and workers instead have to make do with 401ks and other individual savings accounts that are quite risky and subject American workers' nest eggs to the whims of the market. The result of all of this is that Social Security has become the major source of retirement income for most Americans, and that's really something that it wasn't designed to be. Nearly 2 in 3 older Americans relies on Social Security for half or more of their retirement income, and about a third of the elderly get essentially all their income, about 90%, from Social Security. And keep in mind that the average benefit is quite modest, only slightly more than $1,000 per month. So I think our elected officials need to think about ways to support Americans' retirement income. You could imagine, for example, expanding Social Security to become a more robust source of income for retirees. Or perhaps you could think about the government creating a universal system of retirement accounts that would be available to all workers. In some ways, it would resemble 401ks in that they would be portable between jobs and they'd be universal to all workers. But in other ways, they would be different. For example, these accounts might be much less administratively complicated than 401ks, since there would only be one provider. And you could also think about the government introducing a backstop, guaranteeing a certain return on workers' contributions to these accounts. And obviously, that's something that most 401ks can't offer. So the second major hole in our safety net that I think you need to be hearing about in the next election and that we need to hold our elected officials accountable for involves Americans who work but who do not make enough to support themselves or their families. And Keith already alluded to this problem of low-wage work that afflicts the United States. And according to the OECD, the think tank for rich democracies, the United States has the highest incidence of low-wage work out of all the other rich democracies. Nearly 1/4 of our workforce, 1 in 4 workers, meets their definition of low-wage work. And we actually have 20% more low-wage work in this country than our neighbor up north, Canada, does, despite the fact that these are two economies that are often thought of as being similarly liberal and capitalist in their orientation. Now, this high level of low-wage work directly translates into a higher poverty rate, as you've already heard. And this is where programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit come in, which I previously mentioned. This is really essential, and it offers tax cuts mostly to parents who are working. And it's quite successful. In 2012, it lifted nearly 7 million Americans out of poverty. But the EITC or the Earned Income Tax Credit, is limited in the sense that it only provides meaningful benefits to working parents and really leaves out childless adults, despite the fact that many of these individuals are still in poverty and they do need support. So we need to think about ways of expanding the EITC to cover these additional populations. A final hole in our safety net involves support for workers who find themselves unemployed, perhaps because of globalization or of other forces. It's not just them being laid off, it's them needing to take time off for sickness or to take care of a family member who is ill or disabled. Our current system of unemployment insurance is really patchy, and it does a very poor job of reaching the sort of disadvantaged workers whom you might think would most benefit from access to the system. Populations like single mothers, minorities, and poorly educated workers have a really hard time accessing unemployment insurance. Their take-up rates are much lower than you would expect. Even for the individuals who are lucky enough to receive unemployment insurance, benefits are quite modest and are only available for brief periods of time during normal economic conditions. So I think our elected officials need to think about ways to expand the unemployment insurance system, expanding access and the generosity of benefits, to make sure that these benefits really provide enough support to unemployed individuals and their families. I also think we need to think creatively about ways to add new protection to unemployment insurance to cover these risks, such as taking time off of work to raise a child because of personal illness or to take care of a sick or ill family member. We still lack a national program of paid sick and maternity leave, and this is really a key problem that I think our political officials need to discuss and debate in the upcoming election. So having given you a bird's eye look at the major holes in the safety net as I see it, I want to talk about how to pay for these benefits, and more broadly, my idea of how advocates of an expanded safety net should approach tax politics. Perhaps provocatively, I want to propose that Democrats in particular have dealt with this connection between taxes and social benefits really poorly over the past few decades, and I think they need to radically alter their approach to be successful in future elections and in future policy debates. When I say that Democrats have dealt poorly with taxes, I guess what I really mean is that they haven't dealt with taxes at all. And as I have documented in recent research, you just haven't seen that much of an effort on the left to talk about how taxes pay for the priorities that citizens care about education, infrastructure, healthcare, social benefits. They haven't made this connection. Indeed, most Democrats have methodically avoided the topic of taxes in their political rhetoric, whether it's on the campaign trail or in elected office. This means that the discourse around taxes has instead been dominated by anti-tax advocates on the conservative side of the political spectrum, and they focus purely on the economic costs of taxes without considering the benefits that we might get from them. So it should come as no surprise then when Democrats or other officials who want to talk about raising taxes encounter a political system that is so hostile to it. And when the left, and in particular Democrats, have decided to engage with taxes, they have historically prioritized pursuing greater tax progressivity over pursuing greater revenue. What do I mean by that? I mean that the Democrats and the left have focused very intensely on raising the top rates paid by the very wealthy and by corporations, but haven't focused that much on raising revenue overall to fund the government. Think of the intense political standoff in 2010 and then again in 2012 over raising those top tax rates on the wealthy to their pre-Bush tax cut levels. That was a really intense skirmish, and Democrats invested a lot of political capital, especially in 2012, to do that. But it ultimately only resulted in a modest increase in revenue. The simple fact of the matter is that while raising those top rates is important, especially symbolically, at the end of the day, those rates and raising those rates they're not going to generate sufficient revenue to pay for an expanded safety net. And what's more, having those very high rates on the wealthy is going to generate backlash, both from the wealthy and from companies. And these are powerful political actors in our political system. So my provocative argument to you today is that if we want to raise sufficient revenue to pay for an expanded safety net that ensures against the risks of old age, of unemployment, of sickness, of low-wage employment, you're going to have to introduce new taxes that are much more broad-based than our federal income tax. A good example of this might be the creation of a value-added tax at the national level on the consumption of goods and the consumption of services. It would sort of be like a national sales tax. This is a device that many other countries use to raise revenue, and if designed appropriately, it could be highly economically efficient and generate sizable amounts of revenue. A national consumption tax like this would be paid for by a much broader base of citizens and would hit the wealthy comparatively less than the current income tax. And as a result, I think such a tax would generate much less backlash, both from the top and the middle, and would be much more sustainable than our current income tax-based system. I think in particular, a new consumption tax would be especially politically durable if we earmarked that revenue to specific social spending initiatives, kind of like Social Security payroll contributions. This would help citizens connect the tax payments that they're making to concrete benefits that they experience in their lives. Indeed, this is what President Roosevelt envisioned when he demanded that the Social Security system he was designing be funded through payroll contributions instead of general revenue from the federal government. He thought, and it ended up being quite true, that if workers connected the payroll contributions that they were making to the benefits that they would later receive in retirement, the system would be politically unassailable. And for the most part, it has been. So for those of you who are still skeptical of the need for the Democratic Party and the left to stop focusing so much on those top tax rates and to maybe give up that battle, let me present a little cross-national evidence for you. If you look at all of the rich democracies, the countries that have the most progressive tax systems, the countries that soak the rich the most to pay for their government spending, those countries have the smallest safety nets. The United States fits this example really well. We have the most progressive tax system out of all of the other rich democracies, and yet we have the stingiest safety net. The countries that have the most regressive tax systems, the countries that rely on broad-based taxes across all the income spectrum, those countries have the most generous safety nets. Denmark fits this example well, and we've heard already about the efforts that the Scandinavian countries go to reduce poverty. It's incredibly effective, but how do they pay for those benefits? They pay for them in a quite regressive manner through value-added taxes, a broad-based income tax. These are taxes that hit the middle and the poor much more than our current federal income tax-based system. So I don't think that relationship between tax progressivity and the generosity of the social safety net is a coincidence. I think that when you have a broad-based tax like you do in the Scandinavian countries, there's a lot less political backlash from powerful actors in society, and you get more buy-in from the middle. So, to conclude, I think there are a number of important holes in our safety net with regards to our retirement security system, with regards to our unemployment system and our system for providing benefits to people who are out of work, and finally, with regards to people who are in low-wage employment. And we need new and expanded social programs to address those issues. But to do that, we're going to need more revenue, and that's going to require expanded taxes. And what's more, I think it's going to require a new discourse around taxes, one that abandons those battles over the top rates of the income tax and focuses the conversation on broad-based taxes shared by everyone. So, on that provocative note, I will stop and open it up for discussion.
Thank you, Alex. That is a provocative note, and I certainly want to follow up on that. Wow, you know, when you think about how divisive the current political climate is, and how exactly, you touched on it a little bit, can I ask you to just expand a little bit more on how you frame this debate when, you know, even raising it is sort of to your detriment? How do you get the left to have the guts to stand up and say, let's raise the taxes on the middle class?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think Obama has really been done in by his campaign promise not to raise taxes on any household making under $250,000. You know, it makes for good rhetoric, and I think it's powerful symbolically, but that's not where the money is. And I think if you want sustainable taxes, you're going to have to go under that limit. And that's really what the Scandinavian countries and the Nordic countries have done to fund their social welfare systems. But to get the left on board, how to do that? Tell them that that's where the money is, and that's how they could generate sustainable taxes that really could fund a safety net that they want. And for the right to get the right on board, tell them that it's a tax paid by everyone. I mean, you see this playing out over the states. A number of conservative Republican governors have proposed doing away with the income taxes in their states because they're against tax progressivity. They resent the fact that these taxes hit the wealthiest and corporations the hardest, and they want to replace them with sales taxes. So I think in some ways it resonates with those priorities on the right.
Interesting. Why don't we go right to the audience? I see we've got the gentleman already.
My name is Mitchell Steiner. I don't understand how this is at all feasible in the current climate, because the Democrats were just totally afraid to ever mention taxes in any regard because they're afraid of being labeled tax and spend Democrats. And the Republicans have been adamant, no taxes. So they're both, I think, basically have already said, no. How do you get by that?
No, I totally agree with you that Democrats have shot themselves in their foot by ignoring the issue of taxation for so long. You can't you can't talk about all the things that you want government to do without talking about how you're going to pay for it. And I think that link in citizens' minds has been erased, that taxes go to fund the sort of things that you experience every day and you benefit from. So I think they need to start talking about it more, and they need to talk about it in ways that emphasize the contributions that we all make to the system. So I think that that's a start, to just talk about it more and raise the visibility of it.
Sure. Next question.
Hi, my name is Ann Smith, and I have an interest in social policy. And when we lived in Denmark, I was very interested in their policy, especially that they, after the World War, they saw this income inequality, and they used taxes to chop the top, to change that dramatically. They increased the level of the poor people's income and decreased the rich. But, and they have very wonderful ideas, I thought, about how to tackle poverty. The one question that came when we got to meet the American ambassador, and he said, well, we have a problem with Denmark. This was in the 70s. They're going to be head of NATO, and that the Danish military really doesn't function on the weekends. They go to the country. Now, that isn't true now, I'm sure, but I'm saying it just emphasizes the fact that Scandinavian countries and other countries we're comparing ourselves to don't have a leading role in international politics that we do, and don't have the military complex that we do. And no one has addressed that problem of we are using a lot of our resources in that area, and many people feel that's an important role. So how do you address that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, so I have addressed it by totally ignoring it. Yeah, I agree with you that, there are a lot of people in this country who think that we need to continue to play a leading role in the world, and that requires a robust military, which is very expensive. And it has developed this whole complex around it that makes it very hard to cut. So I think in my mind, I've given up on any sort of effort to cut that, and that's why I'm trying to think about new ways to raise revenue, since I think within the current pie, there's not much that you can cut from there, realistically. So.
Okay, another question?
Yeah, Ali Sulo again. Are there other examples besides Georgia that have taken some of their tax revenue money and specifically designated it to universal pre-K in their state? And that either came from the lottery or cigarette tax. I mean, there was a specific campaign around a specific revenue generating idea that funded universal pre-K in that state, and that might be an example of other kinds of things that could happen statewide or federally.
Yeah. I'm not aware of other similar initiatives, but I do have a colleague in my graduate program, Vanessa Williamson, who's been looking into this question of when do people in the states decide to raise their own taxes, and what she finds that one of the key ingredients is when they're specifically earmarked to priorities that citizens care about, like pre-K and education.
Good. Next question.
I have a question for you, Alex, that relates to the inequality. How do you factor social inequality into your tax proposal, and how does it seems that broadly based taxes reduce inequality, but when you start with a system like the United States, which is extremely unequal and perhaps one of the most unequal of all of the rich democracies as you class them, how does that initial position of inequality work with the idea of taxing everybody with a VAT level of 12% or 14%?
Yeah, that's a great question. So to zoom out cross-nationally again, those Scandinavian countries, the Nordic countries, they don't reduce inequality through taxes per se. So because they're broad-based taxes, they don't have much of an effect on inequality reduction. the inequality reduction happens on the spending side because they disproportionately spend on the poor in their countries by providing public services that are worth a lot more to those poor groups. So I think my proposal would address inequality in so much as it would allow us to spend money on the sort of things that would raise the standard of living for the bottom. And the fact that we do have this skyrocketing inequality at the very top, I think, just means that it's going to make it all the more difficult to try and change those rates because those people are really politically powerful and they don't like paying taxes. So.
Great, thank you, Alex. Great discussion so far. Let's move on to our last speaker, Jack Schneider of Holy Cross, who will be talking to us about education issues.
Keith has a haircut for the radio. I have an outfit for the radio. People on the radio are going to think I'm naked. It's been interesting to see some of the connections developing among the 3 points about which we're talking, because of course K-12 education is paid for with tax dollars, as is much of higher education, and then of course education is often seen and often can be an effective means of addressing inequality. So I think there's an interesting relationship among these 3 topics here. I've focused my comments on the things that young voters should be particularly cued into, that they will be likely to be hearing in the upcoming elections. First, in national elections, particularly the congressional elections that will be held to elect members to the House of Representatives, and then a third of the Senate will be up for election. And I want to start there. The number one thing that young people and all people should be paying attention to in terms of education in the upcoming election is reauthorizing the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is popularly known as No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind is a nickname for a law that was passed in 1965 and which is periodically reauthorized and which, in fact, was supposed to be reauthorized in 2007. So NCLB is now quite outdated, but nobody wants to touch it. And as a result, Arne Duncan, the Secretary of Education, has been operating a bit like the Lone Ranger, flying around the country issuing waivers from the law because, of course, all states were supposed to bring all children to a level of proficiency by, let me check my watch, right about now, which none are set to do. So he's been issuing these waivers in the vast majority of states. 42 of them have received these waivers. And what have they had to do in terms of paying Arne Duncan? Now I'm mixing my metaphors here. Paying Arne Duncan the piper. They have had to adopt the Common Core standards. They've had to set new achievement targets. They've had to build standardized test scores into evaluations of teachers, and they've had to develop interventions for failing schools. None of these are, well, with one exception, are terrible things, but they're band-aids to the law. And worse, this approach almost entirely misses the one big problem with No Child Left Behind, which is that we're evaluating school quality in a very poor way. And in fact, the one piece of the waivers, the waiver agreement that so many states have made that is so problematic is building test scores into teacher evaluations is actually exacerbating this problem. So right now what we have is a policy where the federal government is promoting a very narrow measure of success in schools, and there are a lot of problematic consequences of this. One is that it's encouraging schools to pare down their missions, cutting back on whatever isn't tested, things like the arts. I was actually on a K-8 schools meeting today where they were talking about a hire that the school is going to make, and the principal of the school said, well, of course we need this person to specialize in either English language arts or math because those are the areas that are tested. And this was being spoken of to the exclusion of an emphasis on history or science or music or art or all of the other things that we want schools to be doing for our children. A second consequence is that it's recklessly labeling schools as failures when they in fact might not be. the current calculation disproportionately hurts schools with low-income students whose test scores will be lower because of out-of-school issues, which are actually responsible for far more of the test score gap than any in-school issues. And then because of the way that the law identifies successful and failing schools, it's promoting segregation. When you label a school a failure, those who have the means to not send their children to that school will ensure that they do not do that. So voters should be cued into whether a candidate recognizes the failures of the present law, and particularly whether that candidate is committed to a broader vision of school quality, one that doesn't unfairly punish schools with high-needs students. It's also worth paying attention in these upcoming national elections to candidate positions on college affordability. So the cost of higher education has gone up across the board, but the affordability problem particularly affects talented low-income students who may not even apply to great colleges as a result. One problem there is a lack of information, and all these problems are knotty problems, but this is perhaps the easiest one to address. One problem there is sticker shock. Low-income students will often see the sticker price of a college, of a highly selective college or university, and not apply, even though they will never be paying the sticker price at that school. Low-income students also struggle to navigate financial aid forms, to figure out when applications are due. These are all relatively low-hanging fruit policy issues to address. Another problem here, and a harder problem to address, is the way we provide financial aid. So federal aid often arrives too late for students when they're making their decisions about where to attend, and it often comes with a commitment to them that is too small. And in fact, a related problem that becomes even more problematic as a result of those is that we often end up supporting nominally credible institutions. I looked up quickly before we started here, and the default rates on loans for students who have degrees from for-profit colleges are twice that of the default rates for students who earned their degrees from nonprofit colleges and universities. So voters should be looking for congressional candidates here who want to, I would say, first, focus Pell Grants on schools that add value to students' education without leaving them with substantial debt. And that's tricky. The president has recently proposed a way of rating colleges and universities. I think that his plan is full of big problems that are going to incentivize some very bad behavior among colleges and universities. But one thing that we can look to that I just pointed out as a very clear indicator of whether or not a degree is valuable at all is the degree to which it is allowing students to pay off the loans that they took out to earn that degree. A second thing that voters should be paying attention to when looking for congressional candidates would be looking at somebody who supports efforts to focus aid on low and moderate income families, and particularly ending tax credits to the wealthy. Right now, the Hope Learning Credit and the Lifetime Learning Credit don't really benefit low-income families who don't really need tax credits. They're not really paying taxes to begin with because their incomes are often so low. Those benefits disproportionately benefit middle and higher income families, and there are much smarter ways to be targeting our federal dollars. In terms of state-level elections, so I'm thinking chiefly here of governors, gubernatorial elections. Young voters, I would say, want to think about electing somebody who's willing to be a leader on sensibly overseeing negotiations about teacher tenure and dismissal. This is a very hot-button issue right now, and it's getting a lot of traction because it's being pushed for by groups with these innocuous and perhaps even attractive-sounding names like Stand for Children and Students First, which are pushing to tie teacher effectiveness ratings to standardized test scores. So what they want to do is they want to get rid of teacher tenure, which is actually called teacher permanent status. And then they want to begin using these test score-based evaluations as the basis for hiring and firing decisions. So why do they want to do this? Well, current practices are very problematic. The teachers' unions will admit this. Too many teachers are automatically granted permanent status after 2 years in the classroom. And seniority protections can result in talented young educators experiencing a lot of instability in their first years. Their more senior colleagues are guaranteed a position. Those who are last in are often first out. But these are complex problems requiring complex solutions. Solutions like the creation of more robust evaluation systems so that teachers are actually getting people in their classrooms who are experienced educators who know how to evaluate teaching, and they're getting these folks in their classrooms on a regular basis and not just a once-a-year drop-in. Solutions like building in flexibility around when tenure is granted, and solutions like better budgeting so that constant layoffs aren't a fact of life. I would much rather see somebody pushing for a smarter way of budgeting so that schools aren't issuing pink slips every year than see senior teachers potentially be put on the chopping block because they're more expensive than junior teachers. Of course, methodologies for calculating teacher effectiveness based on standardized test scores are nice and simple, but they're also too unreliable to use, and research bears that out. So young voters should be looking for a gubernatorial candidate who's interested in keeping great teachers and who wants to get the small minority of truly ineffective educators out of classrooms. But that candidate has to recognize that this, first and foremost, requires smarter and more effective ways to evaluate teachers. This is going to take building capacity and investing in a lot of training. It is going to be hard, it is not going to come quickly, and it is not going to be done by an algorithm. In gubernatorial elections, young voters should also be thinking about electing somebody who's willing to be a leader on carefully thinking through school choice. So there's a lot of pressure to expand school choice right now, primarily by lifting caps on charter schools. Roughly half of the states limit the number of charter schools that can open. Massachusetts is one of them. We need to consider some of the consequences of expanding charter schools. So the first issue is effectiveness, and the public is actually surprisingly unaware of this. They're aware of the first part of what I'm going to say, which is that some charter schools do great work, and they should be applauded for that. But here's the second part of that. There is nothing magical about charter schools. The main difference between charters and traditional public schools is that charters just have greater autonomy. And in the right hands, that can be really positive. We all know great school leaders who should have more autonomy. But in the wrong hands, that can be a disaster. And research, not surprisingly, shows that charters produce very mixed results. On the whole, if you average them out, really no better or no worse than traditional public schools, higher highs, lower lows. That's what you would expect with greater autonomy. The second issue to be considered when thinking about charter school expansion is the degree to which charters destabilize traditional public schools. So a little competition can be good, and that's a part of the theory of action behind choice in education. But charters can often open in a neighborhood and then siphon away kids with engaged parents, particularly if that school has been labeled as a failing school. The most engaged parents are going to find a way to get their kids out of there, no matter what their financial resources are. And of course, charter schools are public schools. The most engaged students with the most engaged parents will often then leave behind a school that might have actually been turned around and that may not have been that bad in the first place, but instead was stripped bare of its most important resources, the folks who attend that school, and particularly the folks, the grown-ups in that neighborhood who really care about the school. Test scores will drop, more folks will leave. This happens more in urban areas because there's a common perception that city schools are in crisis, and the result is a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that you end up creating crisis. So voters should be looking for candidates with nuanced views about charters. So a candidate who sees charters as a potential spur for innovation and growth is fine. But that candidate should also recognize that charters are absolutely not a silver bullet, and a candidate who knows that expanding charter schools will come at a cost. And then finally, voters should keep an eye on gubernatorial candidates who will sensibly implement the Common Core state standards. So this is a new set of academic standards that were created by the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. The federal government did support the effort, as did several foundations, but this is not a federal takeover, as some are claiming, nor is it a conspiracy to water down state standards. In fact, a lot of state standards documents were very weak, and I will not call any states out by name, but they are often the very states that are then implying that the Common Core is a federal takeover designed to water down their state's educational program. The Common Core is imperfect, absolutely, it's a valid criticism. But in many ways, it makes a lot of sense that there would be a unified set of educational objectives rather than different objectives for kids in Portland, Maine and Portland, Oregon. Additionally, it'll make it easier to prepare teachers who cross state lines. I teach at Holy Cross here in Massachusetts. I often work with students who are from nearby states like Connecticut, New York, Rhode Island, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and we license them to teach in Massachusetts. They then have to jump through additional hurdles in order to be licensed to teach in the state that they're returning to. It'll also make it easier for families to cross state lines. This is particularly true for military families, but it's true for a lot of families. When they move across states, children can often have to repeat material that they covered in a previous state. They'll be taught math in a new way. The Common Core standards ensure a kind of stability for those students. And again, the Common Core is a big improvement on many state standards documents. The issue to really keep an eye on here is how the standards are translated into tests, because the tests, of course, are the standards, especially when we're saying that we're going to be holding schools and educators accountable. What really matters is not whatever is in a document that teachers are handed at the beginning of the year. What matters is what is on the test that teachers are being told is going to be chiefly responsible for these high-stakes decisions about pay and retention. So the PARC consortium, P-A-R-C-C, has 16 member states. There's another consortium developing a test for Common Core. That's the Smarter Balanced Assessment. Nobody ever has a name that sounds like it could possibly be bad. Everything sounds great. Stand with Children, Smarter Balanced Assessment. And they've got 22 member states, and then a dozen states belong to neither. And right now, the ACT company, which is responsible for the ACT test, and American Institutes for Research are developing tests of their own. And of course, all of this will impact students, teachers, teacher evaluation, how schools are rated by the federal government. So these issues are all connected. So voters want to pay attention to how candidates are thinking about Common Core, and specifically how they're thinking through the creation and adoption of tests, as well as how they're thinking about training and evaluating teachers around these standards. So I look forward to taking some of your questions.
I want to come back to something that you mentioned early on in your remarks regarding No Child Left Behind. You said that voters should be looking for candidates who understand some of the shortcomings of No Child Left Behind. Mm-hmm. What should they be listening for? You know, what would a better version of this look like, and what would they be hearing from the candidates to indicate that they get it?
Yeah. Well, so first, they should be looking for a candidate who is willing to acknowledge that what schools do is a lot more than fill kids' heads with math concepts and reading comprehension abilities, right? Those are important facts of what schools do, right? Facets of what schools do. But we also want schools to keep our kids safe. In fact, if you ask adults, that is the number one thing that they care about in schools is my kids safe there. Now, right, a school is not designed just to warehouse children safely. But what else do we want schools to do? We want schools to have an engaging climate. We want caring adults there. We want those schools to be providing arts programming to young people, but we also care about the rest of the curriculum as well. So yes, we care about English and math. Those are the only two subjects that are required to be tested in grades 3 through 8, as well as once in high school under No Child Left Behind. But we care about history and social studies. We care about science. We care about subjects that students are passionate about that may not be standard parts of the curriculum. I teach students whose favorite classes in high school were sociology or economics. And so what we want to ensure is that we are treating schools like the complex ecosystems that they are. Because when you come up with a very narrow measure of quality, and then you say you're going to hold these complex ecosystems accountable for that narrow measure, what you do is you eliminate diversity and you promote a kind of monoculture there, right? It would be like holding forests accountable for the production of reams of paper. Yes, that is one thing that forests are good for, but that's not why we value forests, just like we value schools for a whole lot more reasons than just their ability to produce higher test scores on reading and math exams. So a better NCLB would include, you would want to hear some of that discussion from a candidate, and then you would want to hear some of the things that a candidate was thinking should be included in a measure of school. So a measure of school climate, a measure of academic readiness for whatever the next level it is whether it be middle school, high school, college, a measure of teacher retention, a measure of the degree to which young people feel cared for in school, the degree to which young people feel safe in school, a measure of student engagement, access to resources, access to a wide variety of curricular materials. I would want to hear all of that from a candidate.
Great. All right. Question? Question from the audience.
Hi, so my name's Eleni Mata. I'm going to be a junior at Suffolk University, and I have to say that I'm completely with you that us as the new generation of voters do need to pay attention to who these candidates are and whether they're willing to work for us education-wise. However, I see that the main problem is mobilizing these young voters, because I don't think that people my age, 18 through 24, understand that voting is a right. It's not a privilege, and they're not paying enough attention to this. So I don't think these reforms in education, or anybody going into wanting to help us in paying loans or getting better curriculum standards, aren't going to happen unless people my age actually participate in voting and actually know what's going on. So what's the best way for us to mobilize?
And you know what? That's a great segue, because we're about to go into our second half where we're going to have the entire panel respond. So just hold on to that for a second, because I need to introduce that, and then we'll have each of you respond to that.
Okay.
How do we engage her generation?
Well, I can kick it off. I think that it's really hard to engage in terms of education as a leverage issue here. I think it's really hard to engage young people between the ages of about 18 and 22, primarily because you can't scare them about what's going to happen to them in school anymore. They're already in college where they have loads of autonomy. You can't promise them that you're going to make college more affordable because they're already mired in debt. So what do you talk about? They don't have children. I think that's a great question. I don't think you reach those young voters with talk about education. I think you do reach voters ages 22, 23, 24, 25. I could keep going, because they are starting to think about buying a home, getting married, or partnering up, having children, adopting children, sending those children to school. And many of those young people can't afford a private school, can't afford to go live in some leafy suburb where the schools have a great reputation. And so I think one message that we need to send to those young voters is that urban schools are great. There are some that are wretched, but there are some that are amazing. And there are a lot of things we can do to support those schools. A lot of young people, disproportionately actually, live in urban areas. They could stay in those urban areas. And in fact, this should be a point that states are hammering home and that mayors should be hammering home, is that if we can make it possible for young people to envision putting down roots in cities because we are committed to putting resources into urban schools and helping those urban schools thrive, and that we are committed to not dumping on those urban schools and trashing them and saying that they're failures, those people might put roots down there and they might be quite happy, and I think that's something that millennial voters would be excited about.
Mm-hmm. Keith, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that there's two pieces to this. I think it's very easy to kind of dismiss this lack of engagement and assume that a lot of people are not engaged. And I think that is true in terms of raw turnout levels, that there is very low participation. But I think there's two pieces to that. One is how tapped into things. Are people imagining the consequences for them of political decisions, and is that connection been made? But I think there's also a very realistic response to the reality of our political system, which is that it's often very clear that your vote does not matter and has no effect on outcomes from in kind of a short-term perceptual perspective. And I think that that's something that affects our entire democracy and is not confined to younger voters. And if you think about gerrymandering, if you think about congressional stalemate, and if you think about the toxicness of our political culture, it's completely understandable why people would disengage, and people frequently do. And so I think that that's something that is not really fair to blame necessarily on voters, whether they be young or otherwise, right? So I think there's those two issues, but the most important thing is, are voters being mobilized, right? The most important thing to whether or not people turn out is if direct appeals are being made to them and if there is money spent to actually get them to the polls. And so that pushes back to, what are political parties doing? How are they reaching out to voters? And are they actually making a genuine effort to mobilize young voters? And part of the problem is because of pre-existing low turnout rates, it's not seen as a good investment to spend your time and energy necessarily on those voters. Even though, at least from the Democratic Party's perspective, they're very consistently reliable Democrats when they vote. But you can target your resources, in a limited situation where you're trying to use your resources extremely effectively, really targeting those voters who are more likely to go out to vote is a big piece of it. And so I think it's important not just to think about what are the individual motivations of these voters, but there's a lot of contextual factors really that I think reasonably suppress turnout.
And I just wanted to piggyback on this quickly to say that there's an interesting irony there, because the place where your vote matters most, even though we've been talking primarily about congressional elections, is in a municipal election. And we see the lowest levels of turnout there. So there's an inverse relationship between the degree to which your vote matters and turnout. And I think that in some places, civic leaders are learning how to mobilize young voters who actually do get excited once they realize that a mayoral election or a school board election can hinge on one vote because only 96 people showed up to vote.
Right. Sure, Alex.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that when it comes to young people in politics, to turn out, vote, but your participation doesn't have to end there, that you can actually participate in the policy-making process and have a big impact. And in making this point, I would just push back a little against your comment that education reform doesn't have a lot of appeal to, say, college-age students. But actually, it was organizations of college students that played an integral role during the student loan reform debate as it happened in the administration and in Congress. And student leaders that were college students had a big role to play in that. And they've also had a big role to play in health reform, too, for example, in the provision that let young adults stay on their parents' health insurance plans. It was a student organization, Young Invincibles it was called, that played a central role there. So young adults can have a role in the policy-making process, and you should definitely pursue that.
But of course, they're more interested in loans than they are in rethinking how federal aid comes through programs like grants, because they've got their loans. They're stuck with their loans, and they're very interested in thinking through how to get rid of those loans, as opposed to rethinking through something like a tax credit that their parents may or may not have received for the previous years.
And I think the problem with that is that there isn't enough emphasis on teaching us the effects and what these things are and the consequences of them, whether they be good or bad. Now, Suffolk has done a good job of having a poll worker program, and it's been established for the past 6 years. And we also have a class called Elections and Voting, where we split up into teams, and one team can focus on mobilization, the other can focus on registration. Well, same thing. Well, on the PR aspect of the mobilization and registration. And so also with the poll working program and participating as a poll worker, I've seen that I've gotten excited about being involved in that, and also making me want to vote and wanting to make more young people my age be more involved. But there isn't enough, and it goes to your problem that that in schools they only stress math and English, and we're not focusing on history. And history is doomed to repeat itself if we don't learn. So I think there can be a huge improvement if schools and colleges focus more and help these people register and help these people figure out how to register, what things can they focus on, what things can make you, like what can benefit you, what can really hurt you. And I don't think there's enough of that.
I have a question for you. When are you planning to run for office?
Well, I am 20, so hopefully when I graduate college.
We'll look forward to that. Thank you.
Just to address that point quickly, I mean, you raise an interesting point. The public school system was not originally founded as an engine of economic growth. It was founded, and it was led by folks like Massachusetts' Horace Mann during the 1830s as a mechanism for promoting civic competency and for for building, it was called the Common School Movement because the design was to build a place for Americans of all different stripes to come together to figure out how to be Americans together. So you're absolutely right that teaching young people how to be citizens is a chief component of what public education should be doing, and it's not just about teaching them to vote, it's about teaching them how to engage in their communities in a variety of different ways. And of course, standardized tests don't measure that. So.
Sure. Well, I'm afraid we're getting short on time. This time has really flown by. We probably can take one more question before we, was that true? Yeah.
We can spend a little more time, but I'd like to remind you to come back to Elizabeth's question on pragmatics. And then we can take at least one more question from the audience.
Great. Thank you. Would you like to repeat your question? Is that?
I can try to paraphrase it. So why the opposition of paying for social problems preventatively as opposed to dealing with the consequences downstream? And I think that this does really emerge in a lot of different policy areas. And I think the oversimplified answer is that, especially in the case of the safety net in the United States, the long history is radical opposition to benefits that might go to people who are different than you. I mean, I think that this is about race. This is about, protecting what you perceive as yours and your income. And this is a deep central dynamic through all welfare state development in the United States. And so I think that carries right through to now. And you see it very directly in the debate about healthcare and who is benefiting from the healthcare law, and the opposition to it is very much tied to that. And so I think that incredible opposition to this perception of people free riding on the system in some way, I think trumps any kind of common sense calculation about what would be the actual cost benefit analysis. I don't think we get to that point. But I do agree with you that these things could definitely be sold better and packaged better in terms of really emphasizing. I think homelessness is an excellent example of this. The downstream costs of homelessness are enormously expensive relative to the cost of actually housing people. And so it's such a clear case where it's overwhelmingly less expensive to house people, to pay for people's homes. But that is seen as, outrageous from many people's perspective. And again, it's about who is benefiting from my tax dollars, essentially, I think. I don't.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that you said, and also add just that there's a basic psychological reason for it too. We're just really bad at considering long-term costs, especially when they accumulate slowly over time. And I would draw an analogy with climate change with this. So yeah, there are also deeper reasons. Yeah.
Sorry, of course this plays out in a particularly dramatic way in education, right? Because you can pay for education today, or you can pay for it when? 30 years down the road, right? So this problem with visualizing future costs is a big part of why funding education is a challenge. And in fact, somebody asked a question earlier about funding things through lotteries. I mean, that's a big part of how education gets financed. It's not even financed through state income taxes. Just getting the funds for education is increasingly an uphill battle. Why? Because I don't want to pay for somebody else's kid. Not me, of course. I'm happy to pay for all your kids. But I think I've got $30 in my wallet. But you don't want to pay for somebody else's kid, and you don't realize that you are paying for that other person's kid through all of these social service programs down the road, through that person's failing health because he or she is in an occupation that is hazardous to his or her health. And those costs are abstract and they're far down the road.
Right. Yes. One more question.
You three are obviously, my name is Edward Smith. You three are obviously thoughtful and intelligent. How do you get young people like yourself to run for office?
So I can now.
Maybe that's not quite their area.
All right, I'll weigh in on that one because I threaten to run for office periodically when I'm talking with my wife about other fantasy careers. I'm in one of my fantasy careers, but I have a few others, and I think that there needs to be support for people who are thinking about running for office who are not political animals. And I think one of the big problems with our current system is that you truly do have to be a political animal who verges on psychopathy to run for office. And I don't have that in me. But I do have a commitment to public service. And so, what do? I volunteer at the school across the street. I work for the mayor pro bono. I find ways to get involved. But of course, I would love to run for office. I would love to be a decision maker rather than the person working for free for the decision maker. I just don't know how to do that without without the money. That's a part of it. Yeah, but it's, I don't have the gumption for it. I'm just a guy who likes to think about things and help people, but I don't have that political instinct. And I think if there were systems and structures designed to bring some of our committed citizens into the political pipeline, that you might see more of them doing that.
Well, on that note, because we do need to wrap up, I want to thank our panelists. Thank you, Keith Bentele. Thanks to Alex Hertel-Fernandez, and thank you again to Jack Schneider. You have been listening to Key Issues Election 2014, a program of the Cambridge Forum recorded in May 2014, co-sponsored by the First Parish in Cambridge, Unitarian Universalists, the Lowell Institute, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For additional information about our ongoing radio series and YouTube webcasts, please visit us on the web at cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm Michelle Johnson. Thank you for joining us.